I'm David Swanson. It is my great pleasure to welcome to Talk Nation Radio this week Rick Rozoff, longtime anti-war activist, investigator, commentator, over 40 years experience in this line of work, and the manager of Stop NATO. And you can check that out at rickrozoff.wordpress.com. That's RickRozoff.wordpress.com. Rick, welcome to Talk Nation Radio.
Yeah, thank you, David, for having me on. And I mean this in all sincerity, that you're a person who's impressed me not only in being very mature and responsible in how you deal with issues, but at the same time somebody who's not shy about taking on the difficult ones. And that's a very good combination. It's one I greatly admire you for.
I very much appreciate it. We want to talk about the Ukraine, of course, because you can listen to the corporate news, you can read the newspapers, and NATO barely gets mentioned, if at all. And yet somehow I think NATO is central to what's been happening in the Ukraine. But just briefly, what is NATO? Where did it come from? And how has it evolved in recent years?
That's a timely question in more than one way. This Saturday, April the 5th, will mark the 65th anniversary of the foundation, the creation of NATO in 1949. It was created ostensibly, or at least to believe its own public relations handlers, to promote security, peace, democracy, new millennium, and all things good and beautiful in Europe. That's, of course, window dressing. It was, in fact, created to maintain U.S. military presence in the European continent. I think it's worth noting that the first top military commander of NATO, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who went to that role from being Allied commander in World War II. And so, in a way, I mean, there's a continuity between the bloodiest and deadliest war in human history and NATO growing out of that. And not to secure peace, but as an active war-fighting machine, one which, in the bipolar nuclear age, fortunately, though I think there were several occasions where this may have gone otherwise, did not engage in, didn't initiate military hostilities. But we've seen that as soon as there was any block, both on its expansion and its use in an active military sense, and that's to say with the self-dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and the fragmentation of the Soviet Union both in 1991, that the U.S. then decided, the U.S. being the key player, NATO then and now, to reinvent, expand, and redefine NATO as no longer an ostensible self-defense or mutual defense organization in Europe. We have to keep in mind the 12 founding members of NATO were, with the exception of Italy, every one of them a nation that was on or near the North Atlantic Ocean. Currently, with a decade of NATO expansion in Eastern Europe from 1999 to 2009, NATO has increased by 75% its membership from 16 to 28. Comfortable majority of NATO members now are nowhere near the North Atlantic Ocean. So even the name is false.
The United States, according to some people, spends about half of the world's spending on war making and war preparations, but many of the other countries are its close allies in NATO. What percentage do you reckon of militarism in the world is NATO's?
Yeah, until recently, NATO countries accounted for 70% of world military spending. Keep in mind that they collectively only account for about 8% of the human race. And I think that's critical to understand because when you hear not only government officials and NATO officials, military and civilians speak, but their ever-obedient corporate media outlet, one would think when you hear terms like international community and so forth, they're really talking about the majority of the human race. They are not. They are talking about a very tiny, for the most part minuscule, percentage of the human race that occupies the northern latitudes on either side of the Atlantic Ocean. That is the U.S., Canada, and Europe.
And it's misrepresentation by a tiny elite within that tiny section of the human race.
Very good. No, you're absolutely correct. It's the smallest and most unaccountable elite within that group that in turn runs it and then dares to proclaim itself the international community or something of the sort. You had occasion to introduce me as somebody who's been active for decades in anti-war activities of various sorts, and that's true. I mean, it goes back in my case to 1968 when I took place. I participated in marches against the war in Vietnam. The fact is, and then people would frequently ask me, but how did you get sidetracked into this thing with NATO? Look, NATO in today's world is militarism. It's just simply that. There has never been a military bloc that has existed for 65 years, at least in modern times. Now you have one. There has never been a military formation that has consisted of 28 full members. There's nothing like that. And I think there's something many of your listeners may not be aware of, that since the early 1990s, that is, again, since the the folding of the bipolar world into the unipolar moment, as it's been referred to, dominated by, and I quote President Obama from his Nobel Peace Prize in December of 2009, the world sole military superpower. This is how he characterized the United States, and himself as commander-in-chief of the same. The U.S. has expanded NATO partnership programs, and this is something also very unique, to now include, comfortably 40-some countries. So that with the 28 full NATO members, 12 of them new, all of them in Eastern Europe, and 43, 44 perhaps NATO partners on every inhabited continent. Now with Colombia becoming a formal partner of NATO, and troops from El Salvador serving under NATO in Afghanistan with the International Security Assistance Force, Australia being a major NATO partner, and so forth. Every continent is represented in the so-called North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So what are we talking about? The longest-lived military bloc in history, the largest one in history, one that's growing. It now takes in, with the 70 countries I mentioned, over a third of the nations in the world belonging to a military bloc dominated by one country, the United States. Of the 39 countries in Europe, if you exclude the mini-states, Andorra, Vatican, San Marino, and so forth, of the 39, every single one of them is either a full member of NATO or is a member of one or more NATO partnership programs. This is something, I'm not saying this for rhetorical purposes. This is simply the truth. This is something that Napoleon Bonaparte with his continental system, or Adolf Hitler with his equivalent thereof, never dreamt of. But here it is. And it's dominated not truly from Brussels, but from Washington.
What does it look like from the point of view of Moscow? What does NATO expansionism look like if you're in Russia? And what was Russia promised by the United States in terms of NATO restraint back in 1991?
That's a very important question. You're alluding, of course, to several variants of a comment that's been borne out, in writing by U.S. diplomats or diplomatic personnel. One version has the then Secretary of State of the United States, James Baker, under the George H.W. Bush administration, promising the Mikhail Gorbachev, his counterpart in Russia at the time, that if Russia would permit the reunification of Germany, which is to say the absorption of the German Democratic Republic or East Germany into the Federal Republic, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. As I've had occasion, to mention, anyone with a map at their disposal can see that once you take the former East Germany into the Federal Republic, which joined NATO in 1954, contrary to all the post-Cold War, World War II pacts, especially the Potsdam Agreement, which called for the total demilitarization of Germany. But once the U.S. made the provocative action of bringing West Germany into NATO in 1954, incidentally, that was the basis upon which the Soviet Union and its allies formed the Warsaw Pact in response to that.
Indeed.
6 years after the creation of NATO, there's a lot of revisionist history I don't have to tell you out there that suggests NATO was formed as a defensive alliance to protect Europe against the Warsaw Pact. But that's reversing the chronology and the causality. But nevertheless, when at the very point where the two Germanys were unified, NATO moved, 150, 200 miles nearer the Russian border, right there. And then, subsequently, as we've discussed, 12 new countries in the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea to the Adriatic Sea really have affected a military, and not just a military, but a socioeconomic, political, and ideological cordon sanitaire along the entirety of Russia's western borders, to the point where it was remarked by a Russian official several years ago, I think perhaps in 2009, which was the 20th anniversary of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, saying the Berlin Wall, in effect, wasn't torn down, it was simply moved to Russia's border. And I think that's a pretty apt metaphor.
We're speaking with Rick Rozoff, manager of Stop NATO. What does escalation and weapons and exercises, as they call them, what do all of these things look like at the moment in Eastern Europe in terms of NATO activities that might look threatening from the Russian side? Yeah,
turnabout is fair play, as the popular expression has it, and it's very difficult to replicate precisely because, as you know, our own country only has two neighbors. But the best way I could try to envision what things must look like in Moscow, particularly in the military command, is if a foreign military bloc during the Cold War, absorbed every country in the Western Hemisphere except for the United States, fairly much, had built missile bases, including so-called missile defense facilities, interceptor missiles, which, for my money, and that Bruce Gagnon and others who are doing outstanding work in this regard, has nothing at all defensive about it, this system. I mean, it's meant to withstand an attempted retaliation should the U.S. and company launch first strikes. That's the only way I think we can interpret it. But if the U.S. were to be ringed in by military bases, missile installations, naval groups, in the New York Harbor and, along the coastlines of, both the Atlantic and Pacific coastlines and the Caribbean of the United States. And this on an ongoing basis, including massive war games going on almost incessantly. I don't have to tell you or your listeners what the response should be in the United States, but let's just talk about currently. In Norway, and as a matter of fact, in northeastern Norway, which has a narrow border with Russia, currently there's a military exercise going on, 6th year in a row, 6th iteration of something called cold response. There are currently 16,000 troops in advanced war games in the Arctic Circle near the Russian border. I mean, how else can one construe that? What other conceivable purpose would such a war game have if it was not in preparation for an armed conflict with Russia?
And we think of Norway as a peaceful country. It gets on lists of the peaceful countries, and yet you have this major military exercise going on there on the border of Russia.
As a matter of fact, it's just been announced that the former Prime Minister of Norway, Jens Stoltenberg, is going to be the next Secretary General of NATO. He's going to replace Anders Fogh Rasmussen, another Scandinavian. So much for peaceful Scandinavia. Comparable war games have been held in Sweden and Finland, which are nominally neutral, but they are members of NATO's Partnership for Peace. So many things, I believe, have got past people in the post-Cold War period, if I may. And one of them is the fact that nations that are ostensibly neutral or even pacifist, in fact, are de facto members of NATO. And I'm talking about Finland and Sweden in the first instance. I don't know how many of your listeners, for example, listeners of this program will know that for the last several years, Sweden has had 500 troops in northern Afghanistan. Finland has over 200. Between the two nations, they control 4, perhaps it's 5 provinces on behalf of NATO's International Security Assistance Force. Swedish troops have killed and died in combat for the first time in 200 years, in 2 centuries, serving under NATO. In the 6-month NATO naval blockade and air war against Libya 3 years ago, Sweden provided several Gripen warplanes. Sweden is now, along with Finland, one of 4 NATO countries that are going to join NATO's International Response Force. So what has happened gradually, I would argue imperceptibly, for the most part, is that the U.S. has employed this revived post-Cold War military bloc that is NATO and expanded it into a strategic international military force, the likes of which history has never seen. So that we have, in Afghanistan, for example, where the occupation is coming up on its 13th anniversary in October, NATO has used the war in Afghanistan to create what is termed NATO, as interoperability of weapon systems, of warfighting doctrine, of language, which is English, of course, to forge or to meld the largest multinational military force in history. Over 50 nations are official contributors to NATO's International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. And if you include Colombia, which is assumed to be one of them now, you have troops from all inhabited continents. From every continent except Antarctica, serving under the so-called North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I, for one, David, have argued that Afghanistan, it wasn't a war that was meant to be won, if it could be even. It was a military landscape that could be employed as a firing range or training ground, for building this sort of interoperability, which ultimately would be incorporated into the NATO response force, into the NATO rapid reaction forces, into various battle groups, including European Union battle groups, I might add, for all the distinction there is between the EU and NATO military. And that, however, now what we're hearing from NATO officials is, having wrapped up their first successful ground war, if anyone could call the horror that has visited the people of Afghanistan a success in any sense, where the only truly irrefutable accomplishment is the fact there's a 40-fold increase in heroin production coming from Afghanistan, which now accounts for almost 95% of heroin in the world. But aside from that, with the Afghan operation winding down, major NATO officials and U.S. officials are announcing that NATO is going to reconcentrate on its original purpose, which is territorial defense. But we have to recall, as in 1949, so as in 2014, what this means is arming militarily against Russia.
And so what is the relationship of the Ukraine to NATO, formally and legally and otherwise? And are exercises like you describe in Norway planned for Ukraine itself?
Yes. This is very unique Ukraine in terms of post-Soviet republics. There are 15 of them, of course. And 12 of those 15 immediately after the division of the Soviet Union to its constituent federal republics created something called the Commonwealth of Independent States. It's almost the post-Soviet equivalent, say, of the European Community or the European Union. The three Baltic states never joined. They instead, pretty rapidly were moved into both the European Union and NATO. NATO first, European Union second, by the way, in 2004. But of the other, the remaining 12, the U.S. has then been moving very deliberately and aggressively to wean those other, the 11 non-Russian former Soviet republics in the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, away from Russia into both the European Union and into military alliances with the United States, so that the other bloc that came out of the former Soviet Union is something called the Collective Security Treaty Organization. It's a security, largely military, arrangement with Russia, Belarus, Armenia, and 4 of the 5 former Soviet Central Republics, all except Turkmenistan. However, the crisis in Ukraine is one because Ukraine has never been a member of either NATO or the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And this, in many ways, reflects the divide within the nation between the pro-Western, Ukrainian-speaking, religious-wise Uniate, in large part, believers in the West around Lviv, and the Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in the East and in the South. So I think taking into account the divide that existed in Ukraine, it was not considered to be practicable to incorporate Ukraine fully into NATO immediately. But plans have been afoot. And what do we know, for example, and this is something worth registering, every summer, the U.S., not this summer, I can assure you people, but every summer until now, except for one about 3 years ago where protesters prevented it from occurring, the U.S. and NATO have held naval maneuvers right in the Crimean Peninsula, in Simferopol, called Sea Breeze. There is a U.S.-led NATO exercise, not a large scale, but it's going to grow larger, I think, as we move towards the date of its beginning, called Rapid Trident, which is to occur in Lviv, in the stronghold of nationalism in Ukraine in July. And I just saw a headline today, as a matter of fact, that British troops are going to join, even though they had not been scheduled. So I think that's going to expand. Ukraine, even under the Yanukovych government, which was overthrown in February, was the first non-NATO country to supply a military vessel for NATO's now permanent surveillance and interdiction operation throughout the Mediterranean Sea. How many people know about this? Operation Active Endeavor. And Ukraine was the first non-NATO country to supply a warship for NATO's permanent naval operation in the Arabian Sea, and in fact throughout most of the Indian Ocean, Operation Ocean Shield. How many people know about that? And so, NATO has been gradually brought into the direction of NATO membership, and in late 2008, beginning of 2009, NATO crafted an unprecedented program called an Annual National Program for Ukraine and for Georgia. And this was within months, of course, of the 5-day war in the South Caucasus between Georgia and Russia.
And what is the possibility of NATO nations, the United States, falsely claiming the responsibility to protect the Ukraine as an attacked member of NATO, despite its not being a member of NATO?
That's also a very good question. That's one that I don't think addressed adequately. We have to remember two things. In roughly 2006, when a U.S.-supported color revolution installed president in Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, was acting against Russian interest, and Russia simply, my interpretation of it, simply was ceasing to subsidize their natural gas, and was asking to be paid at fair market rates. That it was portrayed in the U.S. by the likes of John McCain and Richard Lugar and others, those saber rattlers, as being an act of war against Europe, an energy war and so forth. And there was open discussion by the likes of McCain, as I recollect, to invoke NATO's infamous Article 5 war clause, which, by the way, is the reason why NATO is in Afghanistan, because Article 5 was invoked after 9/11/01, and why the permanent naval operation in the Mediterranean is going on. That's also under Article 5 and a number of other programs. But subsequent, I believe in 2008, there was a series of cyber attacks in Estonia, which by that time had been a member of NATO for 4 years. And we heard similar bellicose statements coming out of major American officials, elected and appointed, stating that Article 5 should apply to cyber warfare. So you can see, how the momentum is building up to expand the applicability of Article 5, the War Clause, the Mutual Military Assistance Clause, to pertain to partners instead of full members, or in addition to full members, to energy issues, to computer attacks, to most anything. So it's becoming more and more precarious, more and more dangerous, really. But if I may suggest, it won't be done openly around Ukraine because it is not a NATO member. What the U.S. is building up the case for is that a full NATO member like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, if Moldova is dragged into a conflict of some sort, if Bulgaria, Romania, and the Black Sea, if any full NATO member can be led to play the role that Turkey is playing right now vis-a-vis Syria. That is, where they shot down a Syrian jet, several days ago, U.S. interceptor missiles, Patriot Advanced Capability 3 missiles, U.S., Dutch, and German actually are in Turkey. The U.S. has moved a major interceptor missile radar site, X-band radar, into Turkey. NATO's Allied Land Command has been moved from 2 European countries into Turkey. So what you're seeing is a NATO nation acts as an outpost. It either provokes, preferably does indeed, provoke some sort of conflict with, say, Russia or Belarus, for that matter. And then when there's a response, the perpetrator is portrayed as the victim is the perpetrator. The U.S. or somebody goes to NATO headquarters and acts for, demands the Article 5 be invoked, and then you may be sitting on a catastrophe the likes of which we've not seen in our lifetime.
How do you grade Russia's behavior in this crisis morally and legally? It's often imagined that once you've criticized one side, you've declared the other side angelic. What's your view of how Russia is behaving?
I think of the statement by Oscar Wilde, such a simple one, but nobody else said it, right? That just because one side is wrong doesn't mean the other is necessarily right. And, I've always tried to take that to heart. And we're dealing with state mechanisms, which are not... they're living organisms, perhaps metaphorically, but not in the sense that human beings are or human societies are. And they tend to protect their own interest, of course. However, we have to say a couple of things. That the occurrence in Ukraine, the violent overthrow, and it really was. It was violent, ultimately deadly overthrow of a government which, whatever Ukrainians thought of it and whatever we thought of it, was the legally recognized government only 10 months, or only maybe 12 months at that time, ahead of a scheduled presidential election, where things surely could not have been that intolerable that there had to be a bloody, deadly uprising, and then people couldn't have waited a few months, to attempt to change the government in some more peaceful manner. To have done that would give Russia, I think, a legitimate cause for concern. Because, and they've seen a number of these, so-called color revolutions, starting in 2003 in Georgia, the following year in Ukraine itself, the Orange Revolution. Subsequent to that, the following year in 2005 in Kyrgyzstan, incidentally also in Lebanon. Attempts have been, made in other countries that are close to Russia politically and geographically, Armenia, Belarus. 5 years ago, in fact, there was something called the Twitter revolution in Moldova, which can be a hotspot we should talk about sometime, Moldova, Transnistria. But I think that Russia, I'm not defending him by any stretch of the imagination, the incorporation of Crimea into the Russian Federation. I neither understand nor pretend to, international law or the Ukrainian constitution and what it permits an autonomy to do or not to do. So, to be frank with you, I simply don't know. But I think that these events would not have occurred in a geopolitical vacuum, and they certainly cannot be viewed in, as though we were living in a more peaceful and rational and fair world. We're not.
Well, from my point of view, as a citizen of the United States, for better or worse, my first responsibility is to try to restrain my own government's immoral, illegal actions. And when you describe NATO as launching a war on Afghanistan to train and test weapons and use people and their homes as a firing range, when I see that the Pentagon is already supplying so-called non-lethal aid to the Ukrainian military and people in Washington are talking up war and hostilities, it seems absolutely sociopathic to me. You're in Chicago, Rick, and we had a big anti-NATO march there that I was part of a couple of years back. Is anything of this anti-war sentiment that's alive in this country sinking in NATO? And if not, what could help? What could make a difference?
I'm glad you asked that. I wish there was more. I mean, when we discuss it as we're discussing it now, I think there must be people scratching their heads saying, why didn't I know that, or why didn't I, to really let that sink in? The scope and the scale of it. I just did another review a few minutes ago with a TV station in another nation, and I said of the 194 countries in the world, if you include the 193 nations that are members of the United Nations, plus South Sudan, which will shortly be, I sincerely, David, don't believe there are 10 that do not have close bilateral and multinational military ties with the Pentagon.
Yeah.
10. If you look at the vote, just for example, the other day in the General Assembly about Crimea, 11 votes against. This is what the U.S. has been able to build up in the post-Cold War period. There are not only the creation of a new continental unified combatant command, Africa Command, which takes in the second most populous continent in the world next to Asia. Right, it's over 1 billion people now. And there are only 2 countries in Africa that have not been absorbed into that one way or another. I've also argued the war against Libya was simply an opportunity to activate Africa Command as a war-fighting force and then bring NATO into Africa. But what can we do? Look, 3 years ago, the U.S. military budget, the National Defense Authorization Act, was, depending on your, which account you take, $728 billion, $738 billion. That works out to over $2,300 every man, woman, and child in the United States. That is the highest per capita and adjusted for, more than the highest per capita, I suppose, but adjusted for inflation, real dollars, the highest military spending since the end of World War II. And this was 3 years ago when there wasn't a single country in the world that could be portrayed as posing a military threat to the United States. Let's be honest.
And that's just one department you're talking about, that we got military spread across many departments.
Mm-hmm. Not just the officially recognized. Now, we know that, each year the United States and its NATO allies spend collectively over $1 trillion on arms. So this is what we're talking about. If there is a peace movement, if there is a disarmament movement, if there is an anti-interventionist movement, then these movements have to congeal, they have to come together, they have to close ranks, and they have to target the major adversary. And the major adversary is granted the Pentagon, but along with that, what permits the Pentagon to operate as freely as it does in most parts of the world right now is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it similarly has to be marked.
I think that is a key bit of wisdom and a terrific point on which to end, and it is wisdom that you've been helping to spread gradually for years now. Rick Rozoff is the manager of Stop NATO. You should check out his site and sign up on his list and get informed. Go to rickrozoff.wordpress.com.